Hi, everyone. This is Kalia from Marcus Evans. Thank you all for joining us today on this webinar on addressing the challenges of finding and engaging the right patients through real-world data. This is brought to you in partnership with One Study Team. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets. They're resizable and movable, so please move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. I would also like to encourage you to submit any questions that you might have by using the Q&A widget, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the webinar. However, if a full answer is needed or we perhaps run out of time, we'll make sure to send you an email after the broadcast. Also like to draw your attention to the resource list that will contain a copy of today's slide deck, an interesting article, and also bookmark any links that you might find useful. To answer any common technical issues, I advise to use the help widget. And finally, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to view today's session. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator and our host. We have with us Mr. Josh Brandoff, who is the head of data at One Study Team. We're very happy to have you on today, Josh, and I'm going to hand things over to you now.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. Quickly on One Study Team, we help accelerate and optimize the execution of clinical trials. So we're very interested in talking further about that. And on behalf of One Study Team and our partners at Marcus Evans, I'm super excited to kick things off for today's webinar. Before we do have a basic disclaimer. Just as a reminder, the views that I and others will express today are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of our employers or any other group. Okay. So at this point, I'd really love to introduce today's incredibly talented panelists. We have Jane Twitchen, who's the Executive Director and Head of the Clinical Trial Accelerator Unit at Biogen. Ed Stepansky, who is the General Manager of Data at Ovation.io. And Sid Jain, who is the Vice President of Global Development Data Science and Digital Health at the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. So for all our panelists, it would be really wonderful if each of you could briefly introduce yourself a bit more and share a little bit about the work that you're currently focused on. So Jane, since you are at the top of the list, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, lovely to be here, and thank you very much for the warm welcome and introduction. Well, as you can read, I'm head of the Clinical Trial Accelerator Unit at Biogen, but what does that really mean? What is the Clinical Trial Accelerator Unit? So our focus is as the name suggests, to ensure we execute on our portfolio as rapidly as possible. And a large part of that is identifying the right patients and keeping them retained in our trial. So I have feasibility groups within my team, as well as decentralized trial groups within my team. In terms of our current focus, I think many people will know Biogen as a neuroscience organization, and that's still very true today. Our shift has kind of changed over the years, but neuroscience means complex studies, complex patients, often genetic subsets of common disease and genetically defined indications. So finding patients is a real challenge for us, and I'm really looking forward to discussing that during today's session.
All right. Thank you, Jane. Super excited. Ed, maybe you could go next.
Yeah, thank you. I'm currently General Manager of Data at Ovation.io, and at Ovation, we're creating novel genomic data sets, given that the genomic data, in my experience, is the part in real-world data sets that tends to be the most scarce. So we create the genomic data sets de novo and then link those to phenotypic data sets that create fit-for-purpose data sets to help clinical development or other areas of the life sciences enterprise. The data van ecosystem is something we rely on heavily, given now how large that is and the ability to go out and grab phenotypic data from all different sources and then link up to the genomic data to get the best overlap and to get the best set of data elements. But previously, I've worked overseeing an oncology-specific CRO, as well as an oncology clinical trials network, and then also been director of research within a cancer center. And so those range of roles has a lot to do with how I look at the ways in which RWD can be leveraged to assist in clinical trial activity, kind of both from the kind of the life sciences side, where you're putting a protocol in the field, as well as from the site side, where you're looking to match patients to clinical trials and manage that increasing complexity.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Ed. And Sid, maybe you could wrap us up.
Happy to go next. Sid Jain, I lead our data science and digital health team aligned to our global development function. Very similar to Jane's role, the focus is really on accelerating the execution of our clinical trials, using data science, using digital health, and very much focused on how do we bring real-world data and different operational data sets together to identify the best opportunities for us to conduct studies, looking at these data sets to also find opportunities for looking at trial complexity, patient burden, site burden, and how do we make increase the probability of success across the portfolio. So at Janssen, this is a cross-therapeutic area role. So we have a large portfolio in oncology, immunology and rare disease, neuroscience, cardiovascular, metabolism, and also IDV. So my team is responsible for accelerating execution and working with our global development team on that across that portfolio. So very nice to be here. Looking forward to this.
Excellent. Thank you, Sid. And I think it's pretty obvious our panelists bring significant experience to the table. So it should be a lively and informative discussion today. And specifically, especially if you're just joining us right now, we'll be focusing on how real-world data can play a large role in accelerating participation in clinical trials by providing a better holistic understanding of each patient. And so before we hear more from our panelists, let's talk a little bit more about real-world data, especially if you may not be as familiar. So according to the FDA, real-world data are information relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. And as you can see from the figure on the right, those sources can be fairly numerous and have some depth to them. And this could be everything from clinical data, such as from EHRs or lab tests, to patient-reported sources, such as surveys and diaries. And if you've been in this space, you might have noticed that digital biomarkers tend to come up as well. So this is physiological and behavioral data that things like blood pressure, glucose, blood glucose, that could be monitored in real time by digital devices and made accessible at a level and granularity that historically wasn't possible. All right. So why is collecting all this data necessary? And the answer is really simple. It's insights. The collection, aggregation, and visible analysis of this data really lets us improve trial operations and outcomes. And at my company, One Study Team, we work with sponsors to implement digital data collection and pre-screening processes directly with their site teams, so we can all better understand and predict the needs of our patients. And we have a cloud-based enrollment control center called Study Team, which enables the secure sharing of this data between sites and sponsors during important phases of the clinical study, specifically recruitment and enrollment. And Study Team makes it really easy for sites to pre-screen and manage patient visits while automatically providing sponsors with a fully complete picture of pre-randomization data. And this is particularly important because not too long ago, there weren't really good systems in place to give a holistic view of what was happening at the earliest stages of recruitment. And so if issues were arising, challenges were arising, you would only be able to react to them reactively. Okay. And why is sharing this data necessary? So if it better empowers sponsors who are looking at this information to understand not only what is happening on their studies, but why it's happening, what's contributing to it. So if sponsors use a platform like Study Team, you can instantly get answers to questions like, which recruitment sources have the highest ROI? Which eligibility criteria are leading to failure? Why are patients declining to participate? If you have a study with diversity goals, is your study on track to meet them? What's causing delays at sites? And even how many patients are falling out of the enrollment funnel before screening? And not only seeing if this is happening, but at which scales? Is it a country, the whole study, or something else? And with these critical insights, with this critical perspective, sponsors can take earlier and more informed action than was previously possible. And they can overcome objective barriers like, if they find that an eligibility criterion is disproportionately accounting for screen failures or pre-screen failures, they can potentially amend that. If there's more subjective barriers to enrollment, such as patient not being able to access a site due to transportation issues, that's something that could be ameliorated. It can help improve protocol education for site teams so they can better prepare and support their patients through the trial experience, and even see what's working and why. If you see something's really working well, you want to encourage that behavior either during the study or for future studies. So knowledge is power, and the earlier you have that knowledge, the more powerful it is. And ultimately, all this data sharing leads to fewer barriers, better experiences for patients, accelerated enrollment, heightened retention, and tightened overall trial timelines. All right. Whew. So now that we've had a hopefully quick primer on the focuses and background of today's panel discussion, I will take a little bit of time to get some feedback from our attendees here on patient recruitment experiences. And we will do that in the form of a poll question. So the first question is, what's your most successful patient recruitment source? And you can choose one of the following 4 options: trial websites, social media, physician referrals, and recruitment vendors. So we have about 30 seconds to give you to fill that out, and then we'll see where everyone lies. We have a few more moments. And again, the question is, what is your most successful patient recruitment source? If you have multiple, you can pick the best one. All right, time is up. Let's see where we landed. So looks like physician referrals have the plurality. Makes sense. Physicians know their patients probably better than anyone else and can connect them correctly, but also recruitment vendors and trial websites came up not too far behind. So interesting sources, but human connection wins out. Okay, so we have one more poll question. And this one is, are you routinely tracking data through your recruitment sources? Yes or no? So if you're tracking it in any way, you can say yes. If you're not tracking it at all, you can say no. And again, we'll have about 30 seconds to collect these answers. All right. Okay. And again, if you're tracking it through any source whatsoever, you can say yes. All right. So yes, 3/4 of our audience, our attendees, say they are tracking it. That's good. It's glad to hear everyone's data driven. And you're in the right place to learn more about that. So thank you so much. And without further ado, let's open the floor to our esteemed panelists and hear how they're tapping into the spectrum of trial data to reduce challenges, improve patient experience, and accelerate timelines. So our first panel question is, what are some of the challenges you are facing in practicality when it comes to finding and engaging the right patients in clinical trials? And Sid, perhaps you can start us off on this one.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yep. I mean, the number of challenges, the clinical trial recruitment is hard to start with. We're talking about an experimental treatment. And in terms of finding and engaging the right patients, building that trust with the patient population, that's the first step. And we saw that during COVID. But then, being able to identify the right patients, there's tremendous opportunity in terms of using real-world data, the ability to use this de-identified data sets. We're doing this at Janssen, where we have the ability to pinpoint, at least at the PI and the site level, where a certain patient population is. And depending on the data source, whether you're talking about claims or EHR or labs data, you can get to a certain level of granularity. But ultimately, it's that last mile problem still. Even when there's patient availability, not all those sites have the ability to conduct research. And that's where the point about getting referrals from, when you know where the patients are, to get them to the right research site, that's an important factor. The other significant area of opportunity are the protocols themselves. There are a number of protocols that are set up, and the number of inclusion-exclusion criteria, which increase that screen failure rate. And there is an opportunity, again, to use both real-world data and historical trial data to look at them more objectively and identify opportunities, especially when it comes to getting more diverse patient population in. So we're seeing some of those opportunities, and we're excited about where the future is.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Ed, Jane, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would kind of bucket it in three ways. That you've got RWD that can be used by the study sponsor to inform study design and optimize study design to make sure you've got as many eligible patients as you can that are within your target population and appropriate for your study. And so that to me is a very powerful use, and there's a lot of examples of how that's been used in that way. Then you've got what I call kind of the CRO/sponsor piece of it, where you have to actually go out and activate the right sites and make sure that you can match up the right patients to your trial. And then finally, there's the challenge of the site research team that has to do a lot of screening activity to get through that process to qualify the patient as being eligible and get them actually enrolled. And I think RWD can inform tools and solutions in all three of those spaces. And certainly these kind of IP-driven efficiencies, I think, are required. That the complexity of trials has grown significantly. The complexity of the inclusion and exclusion criteria are significant. And without IT-driven efficiencies, the ability to actually enroll patients at scale, I think, is hampered.
Yeah, maybe I can bring some perspective specific to neuroscience and some of the areas that we work in at Biogen. But I think it's the sort of case in point here is engaging the right patients. And the biggest challenge we have is finding those right patients, because often we're working in indications where we're wanting to find the patients either pre-diagnostic or pre-symptomatic. So it's not a simple case of searching on a diagnostic code and triangulating that with a study site. It's being a lot more sophisticated than that. It's being able to use predictive analytics to say, where could this patient be in their disease progression journey, or how likely are they to meet the study criteria. So I think finding patients is okay when you have a diagnosis. It's still challenging. When you don't have a diagnosis or don't have any symptoms, it's like a needle in a haystack. So how can we increase that probability of success? The other challenge that I want to highlight, that I think, as Sid raised as well, is diversity. So we have the FDA diversity plans now. The phenotype of our patient isn't just one phenotype. We're looking for multiple different types of patients with multiple different levels of trust in the pharmaceutical industry. So the approach for one type of patient isn't going to be the same as the approach for another type of patient. The way we find one type of patient isn't going to be the same as the way we find another type of patient. So there is no one size fits all model, even when we look at different types of trials or different types of patients. We're talking about highly complex scenarios, and we need to try and design our trials and our strategies to meet those complexities.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, on our end at One Study Team, I think when we were researching what to do for our platform years earlier, we also found similar challenges that either there was really difficult to find potential candidates, or the amount of data was overwhelming, and it was hard to see who should we talk to first, who's most qualified, and not only who is most qualified, but who's most likely to engage. Because if you take too long to find the patients who are most likely to engage or miss that window, it can get things off to a slower start. So definitely some challenges there. Excellent. Okay. So yeah, now that we've identified some of the challenges that we're seeing both in our own careers and industry, let's jump to the second question, which is how are we seeing some of these gaps being addressed. And maybe Jane, you could continue on with this one.
Yeah, I think we might have we started solutioning, I think, on the previous question, the clues in the title a little bit, real world data. How can we use it to our advantage? How can we bring different data sources together and use them as powerfully as possible? I think looking at this from a global perspective is interesting, because we have different challenges and different opportunities in different locations. Obviously, in the US, this is mostly commercial data, insurance companies, etc. In the UK, we have a different opportunity because we can access our electronic health records and potentially analyze those in real time. So we're beginning to see different vendors in different locations offering these services, which could just be data sets, could be data sets and analytics, could be data sets, analytics and patient engagement. So it's about understanding what's going to be the most beneficial for us in each of the given scenarios.
Ed, what are your thoughts?
Again, I'm kind of still thinking of the spectrum, and I think getting the study design right in the first place to optimize your ability to enroll patients, I think is where everything starts. So we actually published a study with ASCO a few years ago where we used real world data, big data set, to look at how the inclusion-exclusion criteria impacted patient eligibility.
Ed, I think you may have frozen.
I can step in. Can you guys hear me?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think
yes.
I guess where Ed was going, I would have probably gone there too. But since he was covering the protocol complexity, I think we've already talked about it, right? There's tremendous opportunity in being able to assess the inclusion-exclusion criteria using the real-world data, and you get a very good sense of, as you look at your patient funnel, where you see biggest drop-offs. Now, to be very, very clear, it's if it was as simple as to just take those criteria and modify them and to drop some, would have been done a long time ago, right? What you do need to do is tie it back to the outcomes, because ultimately, no clinical team wants to compromise on the study outcomes and the endpoints they're going after. So, tying those different inclusion-exclusion criteria back to potential outcome changes using the historical outcomes data and other opportunities, I think that's going to be key as we work with clinical teams on looking at different opportunities. I do think beyond real-world data, especially when we think about the closing of that gap, finding the patients is one thing, finding them at the right sites is another, or sending them, getting them to the right sites is another. So I think it's a combination of real-world data with the operational data, right? So how do you combine the two to really assess the patient volume availability, but also does the site have the right capabilities to conduct research? Do they have the right experience? And then bringing those together is critical to start to close this gap. Because we've seen, there are definitely sites with a large availability of patient population, but just don't have the research experience. And you can't just turn a non-research site into a research site overnight. So I think there's that balance of the two, and that's where combining the two data sets, and then definitely going back to looking for the opportunities for referrals, which is still a hard problem to solve. I saw a large percentage of the audience said that's one of their bigger sources. Intuitively, that's right, but from a practical point of view, to send one of your patients, especially for the disease you treat yourself, to another site, it's not as straightforward as it may sound. So I think there's some issues that are still being looked into. How do we make a referral model successful too?
Excellent, thank you. And I would like to touch on the eligibility criteria a bit more and amending those or tweaking those. I think Flatiron may have published a paper a little while back doing an analysis on eligibility criteria in oncology studies, and found that some of them could be loosened without impacting the safety or efficacy of the study. So I'm curious if you're able to share some of your own specific insights that you found when exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at these outcomes in totality for the full cohort, I think the impact can be minimal. So I think those are still things that we're exploring and hopefully we'll publish soon. But the recent data that we're seeing is very encouraging, and we feel like the clinical teams are starting to get on board with those opportunities. So so that's an area I'm very excited about, and I do feel that will potentially have a significant impact on potentially increasing diversity in our trials, because we do think some of those criteria overwhelmingly impact underrepresented populations. So I think there's some great opportunity that we're excited about.
Yeah, and maybe
Excellent.
I could chip in here. Learning about the eligibility criteria may ultimately, if you're doing it in design stage and feasibility, may ultimately mean that you tweak them and adjust them and your final protocol is slightly different. In some cases, it might mean we have to, the eligibility criteria is what it is, but we can also look at it through the lens of site burden and patient burden. So it may mean that we help the site prepare in a different way. We pay the site differently. We offer the patient some alternatives about where maybe a test can take place or how long it can take place. So sometimes it might not be about altering the protocol per se, but altering our approach and our support of the site and patient too, which is equally beneficial.
Excellent. And I think that's a great point too. I know sometimes when sites hear real world data, they're like, oh, we're going to be put under the microscope. We're going to have extra scrutiny, but it can also be, we know how to help you better. We can do it more proactively and build a better relationship before problems happen. Excellent.
I also thought there were some really interesting comments about referrals, and I just wanted to chip in and say I completely agree. The referral process is one that takes a lot of care and consideration, and finding the right model. Obviously, we all know that patients have much better retention rates if they're working with an investigator they know and trust. How we manage to achieve that with a clinical trial site that maybe can't do all of the tests, the procedures, the assessments we need for it is a bit of a balancing act. So how can we get the balance between a referring site and a full study site? Also, monitoring referrals on an ongoing basis through the life cycle of a clinical trial. I think we all know at the moment how busy sites are, and a site that has the capacity to take referrals at the beginning of the study, 6 months later may no longer have that capacity. So in that case, I think it's about the ongoing use of data as well. Where are we finding their patients? Where are they being referred from? And where do they get referred to? So just wanted to chip in. I completely agree that referrals are complex, and ensuring they're effective needs a lot of careful planning and a iterative plan that you can adjust along the way.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, referrals keep coming up. So at one study team in our platform, we have something called referral platform integration. And we try to pull in the best referrals from our partners and also monitor how those referrals are being acknowledged and used during the study to better inform the flow and also make sure that we're not overburdening the sites as well. So exactly the points that you raised. And I think we can segue into our third panel question now, which is, in your opinion, which would be an ideal data-driven approach to plan a good study strategy, and what are the main benefits? So I think we touched on this a little bit just now, and Ed, looks like you're back, so maybe
can you hear me okay?
Kick us off. Yes.
Yeah, I apologize here. We had the miracle of Comcast. So one of the areas I think is been really helpful that I've seen using real world data to design a study is an understanding the current standard of care. So we used to get protocols when I ran a clinical trials network that were DOA, in that the comparator arm was no longer standard of care. I mean, it had been 6 or 9 months earlier when the protocol was first drafted, but by the time the protocol goes live in the field, there's been a change in standard of care, and now patients are getting more than what the comparator arm would get, and you cannot enroll to a study like that. So we actually recently had an event on a protocol I was engaged in writing where NCCN guidelines changed in a way that fundamentally would change our approach to the study design. In other words, we had patients, it was a second line study, patients had to fail a certain regimen in the first line, and they weren't eligible for anything in second line in this particular indication. Well, the NCCN guidelines changed such that patients were now recommended to receive other treatments that previously they hadn't been. So the problem there is we don't know at what rate that might actually make it into the community. And so by using real world data, we're able to kind of track that trajectory of, in terms of looking at the treatment regimens that started each month with new incident cases in our target population, and track the extent to which patients were now getting a different treatment than the one that we had expected them to get when we first designed the protocol, and then make protocol changes based on that. So that ability to really look at what is standard care, and you know, we've seen this happen in oncology a lot with IO drugs now moving through and disrupting all of the normal treatment paradigms really, really quickly. And then we saw it with CDK4/6 inhibitors back in breast cancer, where almost overnight they became used in first monotherapy and then combination regimens throughout all breast cancer treatment, such that protocol amendments had to be done in order to accommodate that. So understanding what is the standard of care today as you're getting ready to launch your protocol, I think is critically important.
Thank you.
I'm
Jane?
happy to jump in.
Sorry, I think Sid, you were going to jump in.
Sorry,
yeah. No, go ahead, Sid. I didn't mean to cut you off.
What I was going to add in terms of this specific question around on the main benefits, you know, when you have a well-designed study and you can execute, there's definitely cost effectiveness is one dimension. For me, I think that predictability of the study and being on time has the biggest benefit, or whatever acceleration we can put in as long as within those predictable parameters, I think has the biggest benefit for the patients and the sponsor, right? It's really the cost effectiveness, you know, is helpful, but our focus is always how do we drive to the study completion in the time frame that we were expecting. And if we can design strategies to do that, whether it's real world data, whether it's operational data, whether it's, you know, referrals, whether it's social media, however we get to that right patient population to conduct the study, ultimately all of these benefits accrue, but that the timing dimension to me is one of the most important ones.
Yes, Sid, I'd completely agree. I think if I had a black box that told me it could accurately predict screen fail rate and enrollment rate and study timelines, I'd be a very rich person, and it would solve a lot of problems. That predictability is so tough and so important to us all. So I completely agree with you there. I think the other point I wanted to add, because I also agree in terms of that, you know, standard of care, particularly when you're running a global study, you're having, you know, what standard of care in multiple countries. But I guess I wanted to say I don't see a data-driven approach as a one-time activity that is just done in feasibility and it's just done in study planning. So the kind of extra perspective is you carry on using data for your study. You are learning all of the time, and as we showed on the first study at the beginning, sorry, the first slide at the beginning, real world data means so many different things, and it's about bringing it all together and the power and strength of using it on an ongoing basis in an aggregate fashion. So don't think of it as I've got my data-driven plan, I'm done, ticking the box, move on. It's what are we learning? So why are patients screen failing? Is it different that the eligibility criteria are wrong for the different cohorts that we're looking for our study? Is it that there's an impact in a different country that we weren't aware of? So use that data and refine. It might mean a protocol amendment, it might not mean a protocol amendment. As we talked about previously, put the referrals to the sites that can use the referrals and process those patients. So continue to use that data as the study moves forward.
Yeah, and the point on protocol amendment is important because, you know, nobody likes protocol amendments anywhere, but sometimes they are just necessary, right? And as you're learning, as you're evolving during the study, that is probably your best tool to make the change to make the study successful. Now, obviously, you want to learn as much as that before the protocol is finalized, but that luxury is always not there. So as much as no one likes protocol amendments, sometimes they're that part of the continuous learning loop. That's the only tool that's available.
Absolutely. And if you do one, you want to make it as effective as possible. So let's use all of this data to drive it. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent points. And I especially like the point of not only using the data and forecasting once and hoping it works out, but constantly doing that, constantly reassessing. And I think it was Sid that mentioned the point too, that it's not always about optimizing for cost, but optimizing in one area may have a cost in another area, perhaps certain patient populations not being able to have access to the study. So constantly reevaluating impacts and taking everything into account is especially important. Okay, so let's move on to our fourth panel question, which is a bit of a meaty one. Could you please share some examples of collaborative approaches you may have used in a current or previous role in utilizing real-world data, and then the importance of using that data to gain appropriate visibility on how many patients would be eligible? So Ed, perhaps you could kick us off here.
Yeah, so I'm going to use oncology trials since I'm most familiar with that. And what we have there is an increasing likelihood that a molecular genomic test result is part of the inclusion criteria. And to the extent it's a somewhat rare mutation, you could lose 97% of it or more of your target population just with that one criteria. And so it makes sense to start there. So some of the solutions that I've seen that have been the most effective have been where a diagnostic company is notifying the physician like immediately about a rare mutation that they find that qualifies that patient for a clinical trial where there's a drug that targets or has the best possible chance of a positive outcome for that patient would get access to that drug aimed at that rare mutation in that pathway. And what I think is important about that is, first of all of the providers have bought into that approach and they're aware of it. And Sid mentioned the last mile problem earlier, and this is gigantic. I'm sure everybody listening in is aware of the fact that we can have beautiful tools that have really rich real-world data and identify patients who'd be eligible, but have no possible way to activate them. And that is the big issue right now, is closing that gap. How do you get from identifying a patient to actually being able to communicate with a provider who would then consent and enroll that patient if they're found to be eligible with respect to the other screening criteria? And so this kind of ecosystem where you've got the provider expecting that kind of feedback from the partner who's providing scrutiny of that molecular data that would convey eligibility, I think is the way it'll go. I've seen instances where people cold called an investigator and said, well, we found out you have 5 eligible patients at your site for our study, so you should really open our study. And that's always met with a pretty negative response, because again, as we saw earlier, people noted that physician referrals, the major source of enrollment, was because putting the patient on a trial is a treatment decision. So if you're going to tell a physician how to treat their patient, you'd better have a relationship with them where they expect that kind of feedback and are open to it. So creating that kind of an ecosystem, I think is the one kind of model I've seen be very successful, where the providers are part of the solution, not just they're being handed a solution and told to use it.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely always keeping the human in the loop and empowering them rather than trying to replace them.
Yeah, you give them the dashboard as
Jane
they
or
want to
Sid.
see it. That's really important. Go ahead.
I was just to say, Jane or Sid, if you want to hop in.
I'm happy to go next. I was going to talk about an experience we have currently with a vendor in the UK. The vendor's an offshoot of Oxford University, and they're connected into a number of NHS data sets across the UK. We're working with them on a couple of our Alzheimer's trials, and they're Alzheimer's where we're looking for those pre-symptomatic patients. So we have to be a little bit more sophisticated about how we find those patients. And we interacted with this vendor both through feasibility on all of the aspects that we've been talking about to date. So were our eligibility criteria appropriate? Did patients exist? Did certain eligibility criteria have a massive impact? So certain medications, etc., would they take us away from potential patients? So we use them in that process, in that part of the process, but more usefully on an ongoing basis to effectively, by using artificial intelligence on free text notes, to find and pre-screen patients for us. So because we're looking for pre-symptomatic patients, they may not have an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So the algorithms we've developed go and look in those free text notes for symptoms. Those symptoms could be terms such as cognitive decline. They could be terms such as memory deficits or confusion. The algorithm goes and finds those patients, and then obviously goes and finds a whole host of much more numeric and organized data together, and combines that together for comparison against our eligibility criteria. The piece of this interaction I really enjoyed was what we called training the algorithm. So before our sites were ready to go active, we were running the algorithm on the data sets each NHS trust had to go and see which potential patients were out there. And then we'd have great discussions with our PIs after they'd had clinics and basically say, did the computer find the same, or did the algorithm find the same patients you would have proposed? If not, why not? How do we need to tweak the algorithm to make it more accurate? So we used it. First step was to inform the protocol. Second step was to inform things like our enrolment rate, our screen fail rate, etc., how many patients we were going to get from each site. And the third step, the ongoing step, is as new patients come through on a monthly basis, we're rerunning the algorithm, identifying potential patients, putting them into a manual pre-screening step, and then a patient referral. So it's very much an iterative process. If we find that something has changed, we can go in and adjust the algorithm. So we have a certain number of scales that need specific scores. And what we were finding is, obviously, because it's a degenerative disease, the score may itself change between the time we identified the patient and the time they've come through screening. So we needed to broaden that range to make sure we were catching them early. That was a really simple, quick step to do. So we're all of the time, we're tweaking the algorithm on the fly as we learn more, as we find different things in patient notes that give us indicators of possible patients. So it's a really exciting one. And my only sad thing is that I can only use it in the UK. If I could use it in all countries, in my study, enrollment would certainly be much easier.
Yeah, I mean, we have similar examples, but I'll start with, at this point, we're using RWD to conduct early feasibility across most of our portfolio. And so that first step of even identifying sites, whether they are research sites or not research sites, just being able to know in a de-identified way where the hotspots are, where the population is, we're doing that for most part across the board. But then in terms of examples, there's predictive algorithms have a lot of power, and that's, the example we have is around FGFR mutation and being able to predict that, and then then getting those patients screened, and that's where that's when you do the actual sequencing, and we found very high sort of success rate for those. That was an example we used where those predictive algorithms, but those are the ones that have to be run inside the EHR, right? So those are the ones where the large scale real world data that helps you finding the sites and the hotspots, but ultimately to solve for that last mile problem, you really do have to get in behind the firewall and work with the practice and the site directly to run your algorithms to identify those patients more directly. And then obviously by then, hopefully you do have that relationship with the site to then actually contact those patients as well. So there are multiple ways to attack this problem, but ultimately that site relationship is critical to solve for that.
Excellent. And I think Jane and Sid, your answers in particular made me think of a question which could easily be the focus of a separate panel, but Jane, you mentioned using free text notes and said de-identified data. Particularly in your case, Jane, we have the GDPR. I think the Artificial Intelligence Act is starting to come about in the EU. How it almost seems like in some ways real-world data can, if not managed well, be directly conflicting with patient privacy and consent. So I'm curious, maybe Jane and Sid, briefly, how you've tackled that in your respective projects that you brought up.
With lots of conversations with our data privacy officer, I think is the answer. It's not easy,
yeah.
And particularly in certain countries in Europe, it's incredibly restrictive, which is frustrating because in other ways there's joined up healthcare and electronic health records. I don't mean to be flippant, but there aren't easy solutions. It's about really understanding how some data is going to be used, whether it's truly patient identifying, what the level of risk is, and assessing it versus every individual country law. We've had success in some countries. We've had some opportunities that we wanted to explore that we weren't able to. So I'd say it's something that we're navigating on a daily basis. But I don't have this is the generic answer solution for. I'd love to hear if anybody else does, actually.
No, I mean it's a hard challenge, and one thing, it ends up becoming privacy comes first, right? So
Yeah.
that's a non-negotiable. So part of my role has also been how do we potentially tokenize our clinical trial data and link that with the real world data sets. We took the extra conservative approach of making sure we get the consent of the participants, even though it was going to stay de-identified data. So that's one thing. If anyone had solved this problem, that's another multi-billion-dollar solution. So it's really working with our privacy, ethics, and security and compliance teams to make sure that we're following all the regulations, and within those guardrails. However, we can end up solving the actual problem. We do, but it's a difficult challenge.
Excellent. And yeah, if there's any innovative privacy officers in attendance, there's some room for innovation, as you just heard. So, okay, let's move on to our fifth question then. In what ways can we utilize data insights to maintain momentum through to the last patient? And maybe Sid, you could continue on with this one.
Yeah, so I think we've covered some of this already, just in terms of starting with feasibility, but then really getting to the site level. And some of the partners we work with do end up working directly with the sites to be embedded in their EHR, the algorithms, the ability to filter by the inclusion-exclusion criteria to surface those patients for ease of screening once the site is open. So there are a number of ways we're doing this. There's definitely no one size fits all for any of this. For different indications, we have different opportunities to work with with different partners and vendors on how do we get access to that data at the site level in partnership with the site. So we continue to utilize those tools based on and what's available in a particular therapeutic area indication.
Sid, or Jane or Ed, have any thoughts?
I think we've talked about the use of these insights and the ongoing basis going forward. I was interested in what Sid was saying about kind of tokenizing the data, and in the example I was talking about earlier in the Alzheimer's example, there's a view that we obviously have as the sponsor, and then a different view for the site. And I think that's really important to say how that changes as we go through the study. So obviously at the beginning, when we're training the algorithm, when we're learning, everything is anonymized. All of the feasibility activity, everything is anonymized. When we get back, obviously, to actually, can we recruit these patients? Can we refer them into the trials? Can we pre-screen them? That data is being passed back to the site, and they're seeing the patients by name, we never see that part. So I think that separation and that change in terms of how the data is presented, perhaps we haven't elaborated on that previously in our discussion. So I think that's important to make. But otherwise, I think we've hit on all the key points from my perspective. And just sort of thinking back, insights. I think the only one we maybe haven't looped back on, we've obviously talked about protocol amendments, is just going back to those different types of patients we're looking for. I think right at the beginning we talked, I think it was you who gave the example of how do you know if you're up to speed on your diverse recruitment. It might allow us to change our tactic if you've got a multi-channel tactic, and also we've only got limited amount of funds. You might have 6 months of recruitment left. You might be fine on your white Americans, but you need to increase Hispanic recruitment. Which was the most effective method for finding those patients? Which was the most effective method for reaching out to those patients? Therefore, do we want to divert our budget? So it's not just maybe about designing your protocol or amending your protocol. It's all about where is our spend and how are we going to get greatest return on investment as the study goes forward.
Excellent. Ed, do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I just would reiterate the idea that a partnership with the investigators themselves is really critically important to actually converting, line of sight to an eligible patient to an enrolled patient. And that last mile problem is always going to be the hardest one to solve. And it usually can only be solved by a partnership where the provider investigator group feels they're getting something of value. In general, with rare diseases and hard to treat populations, there is an appreciation for any tools that will allow them to better get that patient on a trial, which would be their best opportunity for a positive outcome. So they will welcome that as long as that tool works within the confines of their workflows and that the partnership is understood. And I think that engagement is critically important.
Absolutely. And before I jump to the last question, I'll also add too that the constant exchange of information and trends is something we try to do in our study team platform as well. Information goes back and forth, but it's automatically segregated. So sponsors don't see information that they shouldn't, and vice versa with sites. But if we notice hiccups in funnels or emerging problems, we can encourage collaboration, communication between the sites and sponsors before those issues become larger. So moving on to our last question, and before I jump into this one, I do want to mention to our participants that now is a great time to submit questions for our Q&A session, which we'll have right after this. So if you have a burning question you want to ask, you can enter it into the Q&A feature and we'll get to it shortly. But before we do that, I think the final question to our panelists is, what would be a key takeaway you'd like our audience to leave today's webinar with? If they remember nothing else, what is the key zinger that should be burned into their minds? Maybe Sid, you could start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I would leave you with this tremendous opportunity, both with real-world data and just data science, AI, machine learning, and the opportunities to assess trends and signals. This tremendous opportunity that's just starting to take off in my mind. I think it's been a couple of years since this really started to emerge as a real differentiator, and I think it's here to stay and I think as we conduct studies and design protocols, that's going to change significantly over the next 3 to 5 years. So that is the exciting part. I think at the same time, the trial landscape is getting harder and harder as better treatments are coming out in the market. Conducting trials is becoming harder. Post-COVID, the war, et cetera. So as the technology and the data are getting better, there are more challenges that are coming our way. So this is the perfect time for us to utilize the right tools and capabilities to make our trials better and safer for our patients and bring these drugs on time for them.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would reiterate the idea. There's tremendous potential here with leveraging real-world data to accelerate clinical trial activity and make it certainly easier on all people in that chain. But it's going to take a lot. I mean, so one of the things I'll note is it's the amount of really critical information that remains in the unstructured side of the EMR record. So, you can only go so far with the inclusion-exclusion criteria out of structured fields. So we've talked about some of the maybe AI tools and NLP extraction and some of those tools that will help accelerate that. But when I first started aggregating EMR data in 2008, we thought by now the EMRs would have solved all this, and all the really important data would already be structured. And if anything, there's even more data now in the unstructured side of the record that I need. And partly that's due to advances, which we appreciate. So, the area of molecular genomics being the great example, that EMR's ability to ingest the richness of all of that data and make use of it is limited. The other thing is EMRs were all designed to put data in and not to get it out. So if we can make real progress on how to create extraction tools out of the EMRs into other solutions, all of this will help, and all of it's in progress, and all of it is moving forward. But there's just a lot of things to tackle to get this where we think it can be to optimize clinical trial support.
Okay, Jane.
So I'm going to take your question really literally, which is a key takeaway, and I'm just going to say be innovative. None of us have all the answers yet. There's still a lot more we can learn here. Maybe I should say be innovative in a collaborative way, because I think sharing our knowledge is going to help us progress forward.
Thank you. And absolutely, like my own takeaway, I think is a great segue from yours, is that there's so much data out there today, more than ever before. There's still a lot of challenges to making it actionable, explainable, but that it's a team effort. It should be part of a conversation, constantly looking at the risks and the opportunities. And if it's part of an ongoing discussion, I think it'll have much more good than potential harm. So excellent. All right, thank you everyone. And yeah, now we're gonna move on to our Q&A portion of the panel. And it looks like we had some questions coming through. And the first one is, are patient advocacy groups a good route when trying to motivate quality leads and referrals for complex trials that have very specific acceptance and exclusion criteria? So anyone want to take that one?
I mean, I can certainly start, and I'd say that patient advocacy groups are always useful, even before the scenario in the question. I think, in your protocol design stage, in what's your patient burden, what are the patients going to be looking for in this trial, working with patient advocacy is going to help us learn, it's going to help us build trust, it's going to help us understand that patient population better. So I would definitely encourage partnership in the way that's right for your trial and appropriate for your trial.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. I think there's tremendous value, and building the right partnership model is key to success there.
Excellent. Ed, any thoughts? Maybe we're not being connected. So in that case, maybe we could jump to the next question. So it looks like, how can companies providing real-world data services partner with your organizations? So if folks want to connect, how can they do it?
I mean, so we already have a number of these conversations, and what I would say is, what's the differentiated offering, right? So that's the key on in that partnership. And so for most of us, I don't want to speak for Jane, but we do get a lot of outreach for real-world data sources and opportunities. And I think a lot of us are pretty further in terms of acquiring the data sets that we thought we needed. At the same time, we're always on the lookout for any other differentiated solution that that can fill the gaps for what's not already there. And I can say, especially when you think of oncology and rare diseases, there's tremendous opportunity in rare diseases right now. And that, but just data from the EHR that doesn't fully curate and clean the data that's usable, that's not something that's going to solve a problem. So I think data in rare diseases, which is curated, and, has gone into unstructured data and make that useful. If someone comes with that, and there's obviously more appetite for imaging and genomics and proteomics data. There's always that appetite, but you have to have a differentiated offering.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think many companies like ours that are progressing in this space have a hybrid approach. We'll have bought some data sources, we'll reach out to niche vendors for other, and understanding the return on investment is nothing rocket science. What's going to be the benefit, what's the USP, and specifically rare disease is really complex, genetic disease is really complex. Opportunities in those spaces are going to be appealing, but we need to understand how they're going to benefit us.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. It looks like we are at time. Unfortunately, it looks like there's a tsunami of questions coming in. But to wrap us up, I do want to give some thanks first to all of our panelists here today, Jane Twitchen, Ed Stepansky, and Sid Jain, for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their insights, to our partners at Marcus Evans for their partnership in organizing and preparing this event. And of course, all the folks out there who stuck with us for an hour. Hopefully this was enlightening and educational for you, as it was for me. And I think I'll hand it back to Kyle to wrap things up.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Josh. I'd just like to say a special thank you to our amazing panelists for your great insights and ultimately just being so generous with your time today. It really was an interesting discussion. On behalf of myself and Marcus Evans, just like to thank you all very much for the collaboration throughout. Just to turn things back to the audience, a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to view today's material. And we would also love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear about what you thought about today's webinar, as well as maybe ideas for future topics. A brief survey will pop up in just a moment, and we would really appreciate your comments. On behalf of One Study team and Marcus Evans, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today, and we do hope to see you again in future events. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.